Hi class! We are going to be making a replica of the object that you brought in for our first sculpture. So what we're going to learn are some things that we need to know about the way that clay works in order to build a successful sculpture. There's a lot of sort of technical rules that you have to follow in order for the clay to survive through the whole process. The first thing we need to know is how thick to make our clay sculptures. All parts of the sculpture need to be close to the same thickness to allow for even drying. If the clay doesn't dry evenly, it will likely crack apart. So our rule is that all parts of our sculpture need to be 1/4 of an inch thick to 1/2 of an inch thick. I remember this by always thinking that my sculpture shouldn't be thicker than my pinky. But since pinkies vary, another trick to remember is to think it's as thick as an Oreo cookie. So we understand that our sculptures must be made hollow. We're going to learn how to do this by making a small practice sculpture together. You'll start by getting a ball of clay, and your table's going to want to get bats, which is just a board for everyone to work on, and a cup of slip, which I keep in the big yogurt containers. Slip is just clay mixed with water. Okay, so you're going to get your ball of clay like this, and what I would like for you to do is separate it into 2 even chunks. And then let's just take a small amount of clay and set that aside for later too. Okay, so I'm going to start off by making a sphere out of this ball of clay. So I'm just going to kind of roll it, I'm going to pat it, whatever I have to do to manipulate that clay into a rounded sphere. The more I kind of smooth out those cracks that I see in there, the easier this is going to be for me later. And I'm going to do that with both balls of clay. So now I have 2 pretty round balls of clay, and I'm going to start by making what's called a pinch pot. It's one of the simplest things to make out of clay. So I take the ball in one hand, and I take my thumb like this, and I'm going to shove it down into the middle of that ball of clay. But I'm not going to go all the way through. I want to push down until I think that I'm approximately 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch from the bottom. Then I'm going to take my hand like this, and I'm going to pinch around the sides slowly. I'm trying to get even thickness on the walls of this little pot. So we want it to be the same thickness all the way around. A place where people often leave a little bit more clay is right down here where the bottom meets the wall. So I'm going to take extra care to pinch around that part. And I'm just sort of gauging how thick it feels in between my thumb and my fingers. It takes a while to get the feel of this, so if it doesn't work for you the first time, start over. Anytime you start to see any little cracks like this forming in the top of the clay, you are going to smooth them over and compress those back together just with your thumb. You don't need any tools right now for this. All of the manipulation is done with your fingertips. It feels a little thicker right here, so I'm pressing just a little bit firmer. And now I'm barely pressing at all. I'm really just kind of gauging and feeling any thick or thin parts. I want to make sure that my rim stays the same thickness too. If you're pinching away and let's say your rim starts to get really thin like this, that's a little bit too thin for what we want to do. So just fold over that rim like so and smooth that back together. Okay, so I have one pinch pot like that. I'm going to do the exact same thing with this one. Okay, now I have 2 pinch pots that are even thickness throughout the walls and the bottom, and they have a rim that is about 1/4 of an inch thick, and they're approximately the same size. I'm not too worried if they don't look that pretty right now. You can see there's still some cracks and little bumps and whatnot in there. Remember, this is just a practice sculpture. We're not too concerned about that at this point. So what we're going to learn now is how to make an attachment with clay. Anytime we put two pieces of clay together and we want them to stay together, we have to do this process. You're going to remember these words: score, slip, stick. To score something just means that we're roughing up the surface. So I'm going to rough up the surface of where these two things are going to attach, and I'm going to put them together like a sphere. So that means this rim and this rim need to be scored. I can use any tool to score that will rough the surface. So I could use the needle tool, I could use my fingernail, I could use this fancy tool that I have that scratches, or an fastest tool would be the serrated rib. So I'm really roughing up that surface. I'm going to get this one. I'm going to rough up that surface as well. And essentially what we're doing is when two rough surfaces go together, they're going to interlock like this. If two smooth surfaces go together, when the clay becomes dry, they'll just fall apart. Our next step is called slipping. So this is where you're going to take that yogurt container full of clayey water, and you're just going to use your finger, you could use a brush if you wanted, and you're going to dab on some slip into those score marks. And you definitely want to kind of dab it on without smoothing, so you don't want those score marks to get rubbed away. Okay, so I add my slip, and then I do the last step, which is stick. Lots of students say that they score and slip, and then when their piece comes out of the kiln, it still somehow came apart. And that tells me that they didn't do the last step of sticking. You really have to force those two pieces of clay to become one. And you have to do this gently so you don't destroy your sculpture. So I'm carefully applying pressure around this seam and making that clay really stick together. Okay, now that I got it stuck, I have this voluminous object, but it doesn't really look like a sphere. So if I wanted to now, I could smooth this seam out a little bit. Still kind of making sure I'm pressing that together. And just gently rubbing with my thumb, very light pressure so I don't make this thing collapse inside. And I'm smoothing out any sort of cracks or wrinkles that I see. I'm really using light pressure right now. Inside of this object, or I like to call it my blobject because it's not really anything in particular, there's air trapped inside of here. I can use the resistance of that air to sculpt this into a different shape if I wanted. Let's say I wanted this to look more like a little bean. So I'm gently kind of squeezing it, using that air resistance inside, and I sculpted it into a new shape. Kind of more like squeezed it into a new shape. There is a problem, however. If that air is inside the object, what happens to air when it starts to get hot? Well, air expands, and we know this object is going to get hot when we put it in the kiln. In fact, it's going to get over 2,000 degrees. So if that air has nowhere to go inside of this place as it begins to expand, it will cause my sculpture to explode or crack apart so that air can escape. So the absolute thing that I must always remember to do is if I enclose the space completely and I know there's air trapped inside of there, I absolutely always must take my needle tool and make a tiny little hole to allow that air to escape. Just for practice, we're going to make one more attachment to your blobject. So use that extra bit of clay and you can just mold it into whatever you'd like. But keep in mind that where you want something to attach, there needs to be surface area between those two pieces. So for example, if I wanted to attach this little tiny thing, this little tip provides very little surface area if I wanted to attach it. It's not impossible, it's just more likely to break off later. So if I'm going to attach this little U-shaped thing to the top of my kind of bean pod shaped blobject, I'm going to put it where I want it to go. I'm going to take my needle tool and kind of trace around where it's going to attach. So now I know that I need to score here and here. So I'm going to take my little scoring tool, make those score marks. I'm going to make my score marks here and here. Score, slip, and stick. Oops. Now I don't need to completely rub in this seam. If I like it so that I can see kind of this line where they attach, then I can leave it just like that. I don't have to smooth it together. If I wanted to, I could really take my finger and smooth those two parts together, but I kind of like how it looks like two separate pieces. Okay, and we're done with our sculpture. I want to just double check and make sure that that air hole didn't get closed up. It still goes, has a hole penetrating into the air pocket in there to make sure that that air can escape once this is fired. And I'm done.